Okay, so beautiful. Okay, so today what we're going to do is I want to start out and just, of course, just see how you guys are doing, see how the shooting is going, see if you guys have questions, and then we're going to talk a little bit of composition. We're gonna break the composition discussion into a couple of different sections. So we're going to tackle the kind of the first half of composition today. Some things that are going to make sense in terms of a shooting assignment. I say assignment, but it's not like, don't worry, there's no homework, you're not going to be graded. This is all fun. That's the beauty of doing a workshop. But we're going to do a shooting exercise. We're going to go out and we're going to do some shooting, particularly trying to focus on controlling depth of field, which we've talked a little bit about. But we're going to put it into practice. Last week, we tried to put into practice a better understanding of shutter speed. This week, we're going to try to put into practice a better understanding of how to use aperture and other things to control depth of field. And we're going to talk about some things compositionally that will help us to create stronger images as well, that kind of are going to pertain to also how we would pair some of these technical features with composition, specifically with depth of field. So we want to talk about some different compositional things. Some of the things that you, I jumped right over the question part. How are we doing? Before I jump right into that, I'm just so excited to get started. How are we doing? How is shooting going? Did everyone get out and take their cameras for a walk since the last time we met?
Briefly this morning.
Okay, all right. That's because remember, it's like having a dog. You can't, if you have a dog, you have to take your dog out for a walk. If you have a camera, you have to take your camera out for a walk. Otherwise, that's just cruel, all right? So hopefully you guys are getting an opportunity to do some shooting. Obviously, we're going to try to do some in the class as well, so that you guys work through some of the challenges and make sure that you're getting some practice. And as you have questions and run into things, we can help you with that. And so that's the whole idea, is really accelerating your experience with photography with this. Okay. Of course, anytime you have questions, you can always ask, but I wanted to kind of open up for a second, just see if anyone had any burning questions. All right, now let's get into talking about composition. So I like to start, the conversation about composition just by kind of, identifying that, like, we look at photographs and other people's photographs and we admire their photographs, but we don't necessarily know why. It's like, why do we connect with their photographs? Why do we connect with that photographer's photograph that we admire? What is it that they're doing that is making their photograph, so much more appealing or meaningful to us? And the answer is there's all kinds of compositional tools, a number of things that we can do and apply to our own photography that will improve and strengthen our photography in the same way, so that when other people see our photographs, they start to see these things exhibited. It's predictable. One of the things that we have to understand is that photography is a form of visual communication. And so we're actually talking about, we're going to leverage, an understanding of like how people think and human behavior in a way that we can predict how people are going to respond to our photographs in some respects, which is great news because it's not a guessing game. This is how we bridge that gap from, taking a photograph to making a photograph. Taking a photograph, it's like, I'm there, I saw it, I took a snapshot. Making a photograph, now we're going to start talking about, I'm here, I see this thing, I connect with this thing. I'm going to think about why I have connected with this thing, and I'm going to try to compose in such a way that I can communicate to other people what it is that I connected with. What was going on, mentally for me, emotionally for me, and how can I compose now in such a way that when other people look at that photograph, there's a pretty good chance that they're going to get that same idea or feeling from that photograph, okay? There's all kinds of tools that we can use to do that. Some of them are really simple. Some of, in fact, one of them is where it's simplicity. It's like, which is a principle of just so many things that we do in life. Some of them are very, very easy to apply. And again, very predictable. We know how people respond to different visual stimulus. So just by starting to think more deliberately about these things, we can start to apply that to our own photography. And now our photographs will be that, those photographs that other people look at and go, wow, that's really great. I wish I knew how to do that. And again, a lot of this is actually founded, this is, we talk about the arts as like, a soft science, but that's actually kind of ridiculous because there's all kinds of research. Like we know how people respond to certain things. There are people who literally study these things. So that's why we have these conversations about composition and to talk about why people read things the way they do. So one of the first things that we like to talk about is this thing called the rule of thirds. A lot of these are things that are going to be, may not be new ideas to you. You might not have understood what is it exactly that we're trying to do with some of these principles, but you're probably aware of it. Most of you probably have some awareness of rule of thirds because the people who manufacture cameras and even our cell phones are so in tune with the power of rule of thirds that when you take a photograph with your cell phone, most likely one of the things that pops up is what? A grid that breaks the image into the rule of thirds. Most of your cameras actually have the capability of displaying a grid that aligns with the rule of thirds, okay? So let's talk about what the rule of thirds is and why it does, why it is that we see that as a positive thing. And the answer is there's all kinds of ways that rule of thirds is a really great tool. Very basically, we are going to break what we're looking at into this grid of thirds. And generally speaking, when we place our subject off center into one of these thirds, people generally find the photograph more interesting and visually appealing. We have research that tells us that people actually, they look at the images, they prefer these images. Now, there's more to it than that. There's a reason why people find these images to be more interesting and visually appealing. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. It has to do with this balance and interest, okay? It helps us create more balanced and interesting shots. One of the things that rule of thirds does is that it actually works with the movement of a photograph. So very connected with balance. So when we say balance and interest, it has to do with how the eye navigates the photograph and where we place that interest and keep the eye in the composition. One of the things that we look for is directional quality, okay? All visual art communication has this quality that we call vector, or we can just more simply call it movement. Our eye naturally is looking for, hierarchy and lines to follow. It's trying to make sense of what it sees. So most photographs are going to have a directional quality. Some of them have a conflicted directional quality, but most of them are going to have a fairly obvious directional quality. We want to use that when we apply the rule of thirds. We want to move the directional quality into the frame as opposed to out of the frame. So you can see here, it's tough to see here. For this particular photograph, we have this beautiful landscape here, and we have this rock formation in the lower right third. And on top of the rock formation is a man standing on the rock formation. And I know it's tough for you guys to see a little further back. He's actually facing into the frame. So as the eye navigates this, there's all kinds of things that the eye is reading. It's reading contrast, it's reading line, all kinds of things. But I think that you can probably generally see that the eye is going to come to rest a little bit at first in this lower right third. And then because we see this man standing on top of the rock formation, facing into that, our eye will naturally lead into the center of the frame. So directional quality of the image is one of the things that we look for and use a great deal when it comes to rule of thirds. So we're going to place points of interest in the rule of thirds, and then we're going to pay attention to the directional quality of the image when it comes to rule of thirds as well. There's also, kind of other things that we do with rule of thirds, like we typically want to move the horizon line to align with one of the thirds. So we typically avoid putting the horizon line right in the middle of the image. And of course, these are guidelines. One of the things I always like to talk about with these is that the compositional guidelines are guidelines. They're not a prism. There's always a reason that we would like, okay, I'm going to ignore this one today, and I have a good reason to do that, and it's okay. So understand that, it's not like a formula necessarily. It's subjective. We have to kind of like practice it. There's a quote I like, and I'm going to butcher the quote. It's understanding the guidelines of photographic composition will not make you a great photographer any more than understanding the rules of the English language will make a Hemingway out of you. Okay, so it's not so structured. It's not a mathematical equation. All right. And when we talk about the horizon line, we typically don't want it right in the center. And what we say about that is, in fact, there's a photographer who's going to be doing a workshop here in August, who's fabulous. And one of the things she says is, if there's interest in the foreground, show the foreground. If there's interest in the background, show the background. That's how we decide where to move that horizon line. So if we have a beautiful foreground, move the horizon line up, feature the foreground. If we have a beautiful background, move the horizon down and then feature that background. Breaking the rule of thirds, okay? One of the things about the rule of thirds, it has to do with motion, okay? Images that adhere to the rule of thirds appear to be more active, have more energy, movement than a photograph that does not. But there might be a situation in which we want the eye to settle. We want to communicate, stillness, stability. So there are situations in which it's perfectly fine to center something up in the middle of your frame. Just understand that you are communicating visually that whatever that subject is, it is at rest. That is how people read a centered image. The subject is more at rest. Okay, so all kinds of great ways that we can apply this, and it's a great thing to practice and for you guys to research. And that's another good point. We don't have the time to really dig deep into every one of these compositional guidelines and talk about all the great ways that you can apply that. So this is a foundation. This is something for you guys to start your exploration. So do continue to look at, research, and read about some of these compositional guidelines we're talking about with you guys today. Okay. All right. You guys know about simplicity. We all know. KISS, keep it simple. I won't say that last word. I'd never say that last word to you guys. So, but simplicity is a really important compositional guideline when it comes to photography, because our eyes and minds are tremendous tools. Incredible. And when it comes to photography, sometimes we have to reteach ourselves to see photographically. What we see, Nicole was just actually saying this before class, talking about how optics, how the camera changes what the image will be. It's like what we see is very different from what the camera sees or captures. And we have to be ever mindful of that. Okay, I sit here and I look around the room and I can easily focus on each of you. I look at Tom and I think, what, that's actually it. Tom's got a great expression right now. There's all kinds of great things going on here. I want to take a picture of Tom. This is great, okay? If I just stand here and take a picture of Tom right now, it's most likely not going to be a great image because I'm seeing just Tom. My eye and my mind are incredibly effective at filtering out all kinds of things that would detract from a photograph, okay? So when you see something like that or you're capturing something, you have to be mindful of what your eye sees, what your mind filters out, and what the camera is actually going to capture. We're taking this three-dimensional world and we are flattening it into 2 dimensions. And what comes out the other side in the camera is often very different from what we see because we're so good at filtering out all those distractions and what we visualize in our minds. So a lot of photography is making what we are visualizing a reality in the camera. Right now, this is not a great place to take a picture of Tom. I've got all kinds of stuff growing out of behind him. I got a scanner, a monitor. There's just so many distractions. This is not a great place to take a photograph of Tom. Now, if I want to get something that shows how expressive he is, I need to do things to simplify the composition so that he, my subject, is so clear and apparent and there's not distractions. So that's what we mean by simplicity. And there's a lot of ways that we can control simplicity, including the depth of field exercise that we're going to be doing a little bit later, okay? So simplicity, making sure that the subject of your photograph is apparent. Controlling the crop, how close you are, the depth of field, the angle of view, taking a step to the right, taking a step to the left, getting lower, getting higher, doing whatever you need to do to simplify that composition and make the subject apparent. If you have a lot of distractions, it's going to significantly diminish the impact. The reader isn't, or the reader, sorry, I teach design courses and media writing courses as well. The viewer they're not going to know where to settle. Part of what we do when we compose a photograph is we are making decisions about what people are going to see first, second, third. All right, we have that power as the photographer when we compose. So simplicity, while it may seem like an overly simplified compositional guideline, it may be the most important compositional guideline. And it's incredibly easy to ignore it or do it ineffectively or forget about it, okay? But very, very important. Lots of things that we can do. Again, like I said, it's like as you're composing, again, this is the big difference between taking a photograph and making a photograph. We're not drive-by shooters, not anymore, not after this class, okay? We're gonna think about how we compose. So as you frame that up, think to yourself, okay, what's behind it? How's that going to appear? What happens if I get a little bit lower? What happens when I move a little bit to the left? What are the things that I can do to make the subject more apparent, more clearer, and make it easier for the viewer to engage with that subject? Okay, depth of field, obviously, very useful for increasing our simplicity. Let's review depth of field, because we talked about it, but we talked about it incredibly briefly last week. And this is a tough one. Depth of field's not easy. It takes all of these things that are happening from a technical perspective, they take practice. So remind us, who can remind all of us what depth of field is? Let's just start there. What is depth of field?
When the background is out of focus and the subject's more in focus,
Mhm.
kind of.
Yeah, that's a great starting point for it, okay? More specifically, depth of field is we have our focal plane, where we've actually chosen to focus. The depth of field is the area in front of and behind that focal plane that will be in relative focus, will be sharp, okay? And we can expand and contract the depth of field. how do we expand and contract, or excuse me, expand or compress the depth of field? What are the ways that we can do that? Okay, the aperture, that's a big one, all right? That's the one we talked about last week. I want to be able to write. Okay, so one is aperture. Okay, how does aperture impact the depth of field? If we want to compress the depth of field, what do we do with the aperture?
Compress it.
Like we just.
If I want to make the depth of field shallow, a larger aperture, okay? So if we want a compressed depth of field, we want larger. And of course, the larger aperture is a little bit tricky because it's actually a lower number. We have to see the exact ratio. So like examples of a larger aperture would be like a 2.8 or a 4, all right? If I want to expand the depth of field, conversely, of course, we want a smaller aperture. So wider, DOF, smaller aperture. And that would be like a f22, or even some of your lenses will go up to a 32, okay? But that's not the only thing that we can use to manipulate the depth of field, although that's a pretty important one. Did we identify what the other two things that we can manipulate to control the depth of field were when we met last week?
The focal distance.
Yes. Okay, cool. So that's 1, 2, the focal distance. So when we say focal distance, we're actually talking about the physical distance from the sensor to the subject, okay? And how does the focal distance affect the depth of field? Well, which would narrow it to the subject? So focal distance, okay, how close I am to the subject. How close or far away I am from the subject. So which of those, closer or further, do you think is going to produce a shallower depth of field? Closer. If I'm closer, I have a shallower depth of field. Okay, and if I'm further, okay, and then the third one, not your shutter. Good. I mean, we have to work with the shutter. The shutter plays a part in depth of field because in order to manipulate the aperture, you're going to have to manipulate the shutter. Okay, that's where this idea of there's no one exposure that is the correct exposure. So that's where, understanding how your camera works manually is so important. So we have the focal distance, but then we also have the focal length, okay? So the magnification of the lens also plays a part in that equation of depth of field. So the focal, here, hold on, now. Focal length. So focal, I'm sorry, I always mess these up. Okay, yeah, focal length. Focal distance, distance for subject. Focal length, the magnification of the lens, okay? So focal length, so if we have a longer or telephoto, what is that going to do for our depth of field? It's going to make it, it's going to compress. That will compress the depth of field. And then if we have a shorter, again. So a wide angle, it's going to be a deeper depth of field. Okay, so this is kind of tricky to remember. There's a lot here. I went too far. It's tricky to remember. We have these three components, and we have to remember how each of these three components are going to impact the depth of field. But very important to understand because it gives us such great latitude. We can dramatically impact the depth of field in an image. I mean, if you want that very tight depth of field, that very shallow depth of field, you can do that. And to do that, like to get it really dramatic, longer lens, closer to the subject, wide aperture. Conversely, I want to have a very deep depth of field, like with a landscape, narrow aperture, wide angle lens, and generally speaking, I want to focus a bit away from the lens, from the sensor. I want to get away from the camera a little bit. There is this thing called hyperfocal distance. You don't have to think too much on this, but focusing on infinity doesn't necessarily give you the cleanest images. And that's the downfall to looking at depth of field just simply as these three components, because we don't need to get into this, but it's all mathematics. It's a game of angles. All three of those things have to do with the physics of the angles at, the light coming in the camera. And that's how depth of field is actually created, okay? But generally speaking, shallow depth of field, long focal length, close to the subject, wide aperture, deep depth of field, further from the subject, wide angle lens, and narrow aperture. And that's going to go a great distance to help us keep our images simplified, which is, again, going to be the purpose of like the exercise we're going to do today. Is we want to make sure that you guys are at least developing the foundation, getting to the point where you're going to be more comfortable with creating that shallower depth of field. Okay, this is also a part of simplicity. One of my favorite quotes is a photographer. I always mess these up because one of them directed It's a Wonderful Life and the other one was a photographer. Frank Capra, I think. So not Robert. Robert. Dang it. I think it's Frank Capra was the photographer. And he has this quote. It is, if your photographs aren't good enough, you're not close enough. We have a tendency, particularly early on as photographers, when we're developing our understanding of what makes a photograph more impactful, we don't have that comfort level to get really close and tight with subjects, particularly if we're taking photographs of people in some cases, all right? Shooting further away is going to create more distraction. If you're not filling the frame with what is interesting, then you are allowing distractions into the frame. So whatever it is that you're connecting with and interested in, that's telling the story, fill the frame with it. Okay? Most composition is the most important composition is in camera. We can improve things with software, but there's no replacement for getting it right in the camera, all right? So make sure, don't be afraid to get in closer. Sometimes you don't want to get too close, depending on your subject. It can be uncomfortable. There's also a little distortion that can take place. So that's why we have longer lenses to play with sometimes. But make sure you fill the frame with what it is that you're interested in. It gives us, details, facial expressions. When we're talking about portrait photography, there's all kinds of non-verbal communication. There's all kinds of things that play a part in communicating something about that person. So facial expression, facial features, getting details in the eye, these are all really important things when it comes to portrait photography. So regardless of whether or not you're taking a photograph of a person or some other subject, making sure you fill the frame with what it is that you're interested in is really critical. Again, it gets rid of those distractions. It's a big part of simplicity. You don't want to have a number of things that are competing for attention with the eye. Part of simplicity is a thing called mergers. We have things that are called border mergers, and we have things that are called near mergers. So mergers are just basically distractions, things that pull the eye away from your subject. And we'll talk a lot about that as we look at photographs and look at your photographs, is that what are the unintentional distractions that are taking your focus away from your subject? There are certain things in a photograph that's like, once I see it, I can't stop looking at it. So how do we minimize those things? Simplicity and filling the frame. You can crop to improve your composition. Great tool. Software is great. Cropping is great. But again, get it right in the camera first. So one of the things is keep in mind you're running the risk of significantly lowering the resolution of your image. There's a reason why these cameras that you guys are shooting are better than cell phone photography. Cell phone photography is great. It's convenient. I love it. I don't have to carry around a big camera all the time. But when I really if I want to create an image that I care about and is going to be lasting and is more than just a snapshot, I want optics. One of the reasons why is because of cropping. It makes me crazy when I watch people compose with their cell phone and they do this. When you zoom on a cell phone, you're using what's called digital zoom. It's actually cropping away all of the information. It's taking all of your sensor data and it's cutting a whole bunch of it away. And so now you have a low quality, highly grainy, pixelated image. Same thing if you don't compose well in your camera. If you're not taking advantage of moving forward in space, zooming in with space, and you're just cropping images down, you're diminishing your ability to produce higher quality prints. So really important. Yes, you can crop a little bit and improve, and that's awesome. That's fantastic. But if you are too wide and you're too aggressively cropping your images, you're really diminishing the quality of your images. There's only so much information that you have. Some other things that have to do with, how we compose that, again, are like heavily dependent on, composing in camera. So these actually have to do this next section here, and then we're going to get out and do some shooting. Now we're talking about depth and how we deal with this challenge of we have this three-dimensional world and we're taking our camera and we're creating a two-dimensional image from our three-dimensional world. So again, there's all that filtration that happens. Like I don't see, that right behind you guys, I'm not focusing on the computer monitors and everything behind you. As soon as I take that photograph, it's growing right out of the back of your head, okay? So how do I cut down on all those things, but also now try to, in some way, communicate depth with this two-dimensional image that I'm creating, okay? One of the ways that we do that is this thing called framing. Framing is kind of a tricky term. because we sometimes, we do use the term framing because we are, framing an image. We are putting things in the foreground. We're purposely layering things in our image to frame it, but we want to be careful not to make it like an actual like physical frame. Like I have people who I work with and I talk about framing and they're like, oh, here's two trees, like goalposts. I'll just put those in the front, framing, done. That's not what we're going for here. It actually, we need to have something of interest, something that actually helps tell the story, something of impact, okay? Not just like randomly placing objects or putting a physical frame into your image, but something that helps us tell the story, convey some emotion about what this photograph means to you in a way that also improves that idea of depth, okay? So framing is somewhat about depth, but of course it needs to also be about the narrative and the storytelling. And narrative and storytelling and impact are huge for photography. Again, we get back to this idea of we are visual communicators. We are trying to tell a story. There's a narrative behind it. And that's where we get into like the idea of like, you can have a photograph that adheres to all of the compositional guidelines and nobody connects with it. And you can have a photograph that is complex and conflicted and adheres to very few of the compositional guidelines, and we can't stop looking at it. We can't turn away. And that has to do with that emotional quality, that storytelling, the impact, okay? That's that whole, like, it's back to that, it's like understanding the rules of the English language doesn't make a Hemingway out of you. Well, okay, what did Hemingway do? It's we emotionally connected, so that's the part we're talking about here. And framing is one of the ways that we can, improve that, because the objects that we use should enhance or tell that story or give part of that narrative. So on the simple end, it's just about looking for opportunities to put something into the foreground or the background or layer things in your image that help to communicate and tell that story. So add interest. So natural frames, for something like this, or a landscape photograph, rock formations, trees, leaves, whatever. There's lots of ways that we can do that, but of course it should be meaningful. We can use man-made frames. When I say, don't use an actual physical frame, I'm saying you don't always have to. It needs to make sense with the narrative. If it's urban photography, if it's architectural photography, if there are those components, if there's a heavy graphic design component that you're trying to communicate, then it absolutely does make sense to use windows, doors, tunnels. I love, railings and, a man-made texture when looking at images. We can use those things for framing. And it's incredibly effective. It just needs to fit with whatever the context of your image is. The framing should communicate depth, as we're seeing here, but then it also should bring your focus to the intended subject and in an aesthetically pleasing way. Like, this is beautiful. This is masterful. There's some things about this I've changed a little bit, but that's just, I nitpick images. I'm so nitpicky. It's a beautiful image. There's nothing wrong with this image. Okay, I can't say there's nothing wrong with the image. It's a very, very, very strong image. I like it. But again, just this great use of just, some leaves in the foreground that have some beautiful color. And we don't even have to be able to, completely see them. They're not within the depth of field. We know that they're leaves. We see the organic structure. We see the color, and it does help leave the eye, frames with the subject in the background. These even kind of point to our subject in a way. And it's a really nice composition. Now they just need to rotate it a little bit and shoot it in such a way so that this grade is not right here. That's my nitpicking. Okay, now I'm moving on. This, I like to, of course, tell people, it's like, I nitpick images, but I nitpick images for a reason, okay? There is nothing that any of us can do that we can't improve. I'm the worst when it comes to my own photography. I very seldom have an image that I'm really really happy with. Because I look at my images and that's all I see. It's like, oh, I should have done this differently. Oh, I should have done that. I should have done this. I should have done that. So it's a good thing and it's a bad thing. It's a good thing because we should always be looking for that improvement. We should always be looking for how we can make our images better or anything else that we do in our lives better. But you also have to, at some point, let go and put things out into the world. And don't be crippled by that, okay? Okay, so again, as part of framing, we're just going to continue talking about, that depth and the layering. And what we're talking about here is just, we've looked at framing in terms of mostly something in the foreground, but we want to point out that there's other ways that we can create that depth and layering, and that's part of framing. And it's recognizing things like, okay, we want to communicate. Can we communicate foreground, middle ground, background? And there's lots of different ways that we can do that. And it also depends on what you're trying to do with a particular image, what you're actually trying to communicate, and where the interest is. There's all kinds of ways that we can do that. So foreground, middle, background, it can be really simple. It's like, foreground can be communicated just by like, we have something in the foreground and it's soft, it's out of focus, it's not within the depth of field, but that helps to communicate that depth, okay? Middle ground, obviously, like any area in here, we have several layers here. I mean, well, maybe not. We have the dock, the lines of the dock, we have the water. This is a really complex image, but it's a good example of all of these different things layering in. Obviously, the plane, the birds. We have this line out of trees out on the other edge of the water. These are all we can really set our images up to identify so many layers of depth. And we should be mindful and deliberate about that. Like, what does it actually add to the image? Make sure that all of these things do not detract from what our subject is, but if we compose well, we can give that idea, that feeling of depth in that image, even though we are compressing into something that is two-dimensional. How we use the foreground, middle, ground, and background, again, it just depends on where's the interest. Is there interest in the foreground? Well, give more precedence to the foreground. Is there interest in the background? Give more precedence to the background. How do we do that? One of the things that I like to make sure that we talk about over and over and over again, where are we most comfortable shooting? Right here at shoulder height. What's the best composition? Probably, considering the fact of all the ways in which I can move the camera and myself and the perspective, it's not likely that it's going to be right there at shoulder height. So foreground and on our location vertically. If we move up with the camera, if we're higher, we're expanding the middle ground. If we move down, we're compressing the middle ground. So that's some place that you really need to be mindful of, like your body location, your angle of view. And of course, it's so much easier now. Most of you guys have cameras. I love the articulating screens. I used to think that was ridiculous, but I can't tell you how often I shoot doing this thing. Like, I'm not even looking through the viewfinder or anything. The articulating screens are great for stuff like that. Same with doing a Hail Mary shot. I mean, that's so nice. So use that to your advantage. I mean, I used to have, when I did a Hail Mary shot, I would actually, it was literally a Hail Mary. That's why we call it a Hail Mary shot. Like, my favorite example of the Hail Mary shot at the end of beginning and end of a game, the team comes together and they're gathering around and they're cheering, chanting, whatever. And a photographer always likes to go with a wide angle lens and get up over the top and just start shooting. Well, traditionally, it was a Hail Mary. I can't even see what's happening. Maybe I get the shot, maybe I don't get the shot. But with these articulating screens, you can actually see what you're doing. That's wonderful. So, yes.
Can you get those on for any camera?
Yeah, most cameras come with articulating screens at this point. It's actually, there's not many bodies that are coming without them. It depends, it really depends. Like I bought a body. It's not gonna have a articulating screen, but it's like 5 years old now. But I mean, it's almost standard at this point.
For some of them, yeah. I would say the next step up from the cameras that you guys have, especially if you're in Canon. So like Sarah, you might want to do Canon 80D and 80D. It has the screen, it flips out and then it rotates as well. That's kind of the beginning entry level camera. That's what I started on. I still use it today. I love it. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's a neat feature, but I feel like most cameras are coming, well, I can't say, and it's probably a durability thing. Some of the more, what's the word I'm looking for? Full featured and more durable cameras are not coming with the articulating screens. And that's probably just because of durability, because an articulating screen is just one more thing that can be broken.
A lot of the mirrorless ones have articulating screens, but that's only because some of the mirrorless ones, especially for Sony, don't have the viewfinder to look through with your eye. It's only the back of the camera that you use to see, so the screens move.
So, but that's something I think that is, there should be some expectation that you're gonna have an articulating screen as you purchase newer cameras, but not to say that they all will have them. I think there will be some models that don't have them, but I think that has to do with durability. So,
I have one,
that's good.
but I don't know, like, I don't really like shooting with it because I like looking through my viewfinder.
I do too.
Yeah.
For a long time, it was one of those things that, it was one of those features I was like, I don't need that.
Yeah.
Why does this need to be a touch screen? Why do I need live view? But I can actually give you arguments for how all of those things are actually wonderful features, and I actually use them now, despite the fact that I was a curmudgeon and was like, I don't need that. I'm gonna do this old school. And obviously, the articulating screen, great for just getting different angles. Live view, one of the things I love about live view, this is something for you guys to check out, because this is my favorite live view feature. If the focus is really, really important, where my focal plane is, and I really want to get it sharp, I will use live view. You can magnify in live view, and then I will manually focus while in live view, and I can actually see the focus so much better that way than I can looking through the viewfinder with my naked eye. And of course, I have vision issues, so that's pretty damn important to me. And so that's a great live view feature. And then touch screen. My favorite touch screen feature is the ability to pick where you can actually use the touch screen to, just like on your cell phone, pick where you're going to meter and focus. I can just like boop on the screen, and now it is metered and focused right where I touched on the touch screen. So there's some of these things. It's like we look at them and it's like, well, why did they add that? Good gravy. We're serious photographers. We don't need all this stuff. And then after a while, you're like, oh, that's actually really cool. You just have to give it more time. I thought you were going to add something. Okay. All right. So I think that's where we wanted to be. Yes. Okay. So this is a good time for us to now go out and do a little bit of shooting. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go out. It's beautiful outside. It's so nice. Lots of light. And that'll give us actually a lot of opportunity to play with a lot of different settings. What we want to do shooting now is I want you to specifically manipulate depth of field. I want to shoot with you guys and have you guys purposely trying to play with and create shallow and deep depth of field. Start out just with that, okay? Just with the technical. Don't make it too complicated for yourself. Just play with the settings, those 3 different things, and just shoot some images and just look at how the depth of field actually manipulates. Then, as you're getting a little more comfortable with shooting for different depths of field, start to look for some compositional things that you can play with. Look for, again, simplicity, rule of thirds, and depth, framing, layering, okay? So we'll shoot for, why don't we, we're gonna shoot for most of the remainder of our time. I wanna come back with like 10 or 15 minutes left. So take a little break, then we'll go out and start shooting. Come back at like a quarter to 11 so that we can have some time to kind of debrief, talk, look at your images. We're gonna walk around and help you guys with your cameras and look at your images as we do this as well. Make sure you guys are